We would like to acknowledge that we are recording this on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. We identify as non-Indigenous women, born and raised in Ontario. We are settlers on this land who are educated in the Western worldview. This video will examine the myth that Indigenous people living on reserve receive the same funds and access to resources as non-Indigenous Canadians living off reserve. We will cover the existence of this myth, the real-life impact it is having on the Attawapiskat community in Northern Ontario, and the ways that this inequality is benefiting colonial settlers in Canada to this day. There is a misconception that the mistreatment of First Nations people is something of the past, something that Canada has overcome. This is a delusion among many Canadians that all Canadians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, have equal opportunities to thrive. This belief implies that First Nations people are at fault for their problems they experience and have the same resources as anyone else to conquer those problems. Non-Indigenous Canadians have a tendency to believe that equality has been achieved, that this country does not have a race problem. That is false. Chelsea Vowell, a Métis author, calls this the myth of the level playing field, which assumes that while Indigenous peoples have legitimate grievances stemming from awful things that were done in the past, the advent of a modern democracy means we are now all equal and have equal access to the same rights. Our research will focus on the institutional resources of mental health, education, infrastructure, and housing that are extremely limited and in some cases entirely absent on isolated First Nations reserves. The lack of access to these resources has serious consequences for the people who live on reserves. Without adequate housing, mental health services, and education, many communities are struggling to escape poverty. Research shows that 13% of non-Indigenous Canadians believe that Indigenous people get special treatment from governments, abuse their privileges, and take handouts rather than contribute to society. This perception maintains group stereotyping and perpetuates the myth that Indigenous people have equal access to the same resources as non-Indigenous Canadians. While it may feel like 13% is a minority, some of the people who hold this opinion occupy positions of authority in Canada. In 2018, RCMP-only Facebook page with nearly 10,000 members was discovered. Comments on news stories related to Indigenous issues posted on this page included, "There comes a time when we have apologized more than enough and compensated enough, and there comes a time when someone needs to stand up to these spoiled children and tell them to just F off." The views expressed on this page and the lack of resources on reserves prove that the very real issue of structural racism in Canada is evident. Structural racism is a concept that needs to be unpacked further. According to researchers at the National Collaborating Centre for Aboriginal Health, structural racism is the economic, social, and political institutions and processes of a society that create and reinforce racial discrimination. Only 1/3 of non-Indigenous Canadians believe that Indigenous people are treated worse in the workplace, the healthcare system, the education system, and the criminal justice system. Nearly half are of the belief that they are treated the same. If this were the case, the rate of child poverty among First Nations would not be 50%, a rate which is unlike any other poverty rate for any other disadvantaged group in Canada by a long shot. According to Loppe and her research associates, racist ideologies have fostered a social hierarchy in which Aboriginal peoples are denied resources while dominant groups maintain authority and power. Over 1 in 10 non-Indigenous Canadians expressed in a 2016 study that their impressions of Aboriginal peoples in clearly negative terms pertaining to special treatment or negative attributes. This negative sentiment is most deeply held in the prairies, where non-Indigenous residents in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta are more inclined to view Aboriginal peoples themselves as the biggest obstacle to their achieving economic and social equality with other Canadians. For the purposes of this video, the myth that the First Nation in Canada have equal, if not privileged, access to certain resources as non-Indigenous Canadians will be called the myth of resource equality. As is demonstrated by the research seen thus far, the myth that Indigenous people have equal access to resources and opportunities to thrive as other Canadians is widely held across the country. Debunking the myth of resource equality is important because it will better equip us to recognize and address the issue of structural racism. This video will debunk the myth of resource equality by presenting the case of Attawapiskat First Nation, whose lack of access to healthcare, housing, and educational resources is having detrimental impacts on the community. 700 kilometers north of Timmins, Ontario, in subarctic Cree territory, you will find the Attawapiskat community. The Attawapiskat First Nation, known as the Attawapiskat people in Cree, are among the 49% of First Nations that live on remote reserves in Canada. The Attawapiskat Reserve has a population of just over 1,500 people and covers only 1.79 square kilometers of land. In 1929, the Attawapiskat community was recognized by settlers as an independent band, separate from the Fort Albany band to which it previously belonged. The band is a signatory to Treaty 9. Despite the promise made in Treaty 9, which guaranteed the Attawapiskat people 1 square kilometer of land per family of 5, the entire band was forced to live on the reserve as the colonizers occupied more and more of their territory. A lack of space and access to important resources have contributed to systemic problems which have forced many in the community into severe hardships. Today, the living conditions on Attawapiskat Reserve are extremely poor, and the entire community remains vulnerable to poor housing conditions or no housing, inadequate healthcare services, crumbling infrastructure, high unemployment, high suicide rates, and attempts, failed child welfare policy, imposed legislations and regulations, education gaps that impede the aspirations with our youth. Many First Nations schools receive minimal government funding and often no funding at all for learning resources and tools like libraries and computers, which are commonplace in other Canadian public schools. CBC reported in 2018 that the funding gap between First Nations schools and other schools averages about 30%. In Attawapiskat, there was no safe place to learn and attend classes until quite recently. It was an education crisis. The primary school in Attawapiskat was shut down in 2000 because of health concerns with the building resulting from a diesel leak decades earlier. One article writes that despite federal government promises of a new school, students were still in mold-contaminated portables 7 years later when they learned that Ottawa had cancelled the project. One student led a movement to bring quality education to her community. Shannon Kustishin was the face of the campaign Shannon's Dream, which worked vigorously to convince the federal government to give First Nations children a proper education. Education is a foundational cornerstone of a child's development. On February 27, 2012, the House of Commons declared in a unanimous vote that all First Nations children have an equal right to high-quality, culturally relevant education, and made a commitment to provide the necessary financial and policy supports for First Nations education system, providing funding that will put reserve schools on par with non-reserve provincial schools. In 2016, the Parliamentary Budget Officer reported that the high education gap was estimated at $666 million. According to the Assembly of First Nations, nearly half of Indigenous communities were in need of a new school in 2012. Shannon's dream of having a proper school in her community of Attawapiskat became a reality in 2014. This was the first real school the community had had in 14 years, and it teaches kindergarten through to grade 8. While the new building was an investment in the children's future, funding per student remains significantly lower for First Nations children and youth than non-Indigenous Canadian kids. The fact is that Indigenous children are not being given the learning opportunities that non-Indigenous children in Canada are given. This imbalance puts Indigenous people at a disadvantage from childhood, as they must fight for the fundamental resources that non-Indigenous people often take for granted.
Reserve number 91A. Attawapiskat is roughly 270 square kilometers in size. People began living in Attawapiskat in the 1950s. It began with log houses, then wood-framed homes that were given by the Department of Indian Affairs. In the 1980s, housing in Attawapiskat took a turn for the worst. They were failing to keep up with the growth of the population. Due to neglect of substantial funds needed to help the community, the problem has become much bigger since then. In order to try and help in recent years, there have been 50 new homes built, but that is still not enough. There is a waiting list, and it is 300 families long. Unfortunately, there is not enough money given by the government and not enough resources being brought in to catch up to the population growth. In popular belief, Aboriginal people are doing just fine on reserves. The government has done enough, but no, An assessment of First Nations water and sewer systems was conducted and found that 73% of all water systems and 65% of all wastewater systems in First Nations are characterized as medium to high risk, meaning that the homes can no longer be lived in due to the health risks. And due to these poor living conditions, it has led to inevitable health and social issues. The housing density here is about 7 people per household. That is nearly triple the Ontario average of 2.7 per household. An engineering report produced for the community in 2011 concluded the community needed about 595 new homes by 2030. Many of the homes are condemned because they are too harmful to people's health and safety, but people of the community will continue to live in these homes because there are no other places for them and their families to live. Non-First Nations people are unaware of the poverty that is being faced by First Nations. People will often believe what the media puts out there because sometimes it is easier than searching for the truth. The explanation of poverty in society is often split into 2 categories. 1, blaming the victim as the author of his or her own circumstance, or 2, looking to societal factors which create, contribute, or exaggerate the disadvantages faced by the impoverished. Society will blame the victim when it comes to poverty in some cases. People will not feel bad for them. Maybe they will find an excuse, like how smart they are, race and cultural beliefs as factors that can set them back from the rest. These supposed disadvantages and explanations make it easier to blame First Nations people for the crisis that they have put themselves in. We can't tax people. There are many unemployed. If we want to do any project, we have to beg the federal government, and that dependency doesn't solve the problem. This statement was said by the chief at the time, Teresa Spence. They are stuck between a rock and a hard place because they can't take money from the community because they are unemployed, so they have to wait for money from the government, and that is not a reliable source either. Richard Spence, who was born and raised in Attawapiskat, underlines some important facts in his article published in CBC in 2013. Housing on reserves falls short when compared with housing off reserve. 41.5% of homes on reserves need major repairs, compared with only 7% in non-Aboriginal households outside reserves. Rates of overcrowding are 6 times greater on reserves than off reserves. In many communities, it's not uncommon to have 3 generations living under one roof, not by choice, but by necessity. The median annual income on reserves is $11,300, according to the 2006 census. Average income is $16,160. Government spends an average of $272 million a year on First Nations housing, and since 2009, spent an additional $400 million through the economic stimulus plan, and it's not enough to get ahead of the curve of need. Low income is a large factor that impacts the lives of almost all reserve residents. They cannot afford home maintenance after environmental accidents happen. For example, floods, fires, and water and sewage damage. Homes deteriorate much faster than homes off reserves, because not only is it due to overcrowding, but also the homes are made poorly to begin with, and did not take into account environmental realities that happen on reserves. Homeowners on reserves can't own the land their house is on. because it is property of the Crown. This means that they cannot get normal bank mortgages because the property can't be seized. Instead, they must have their mortgages guaranteed by the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development, a process that can take up to a year. First Nations Market Housing Fund was created by the federal government to try and improve access to housing loans and broaden the range of housing options for residents of First Nations communities so that they may have the same housing choices and opportunities as people in non-First Nation communities. However, loans must be guaranteed by the community. This means that it can be a problem for communities that are tight on money. This means that it is up to band administrators to try and stretch the money they get from the federal government to cover repairs and the building of new housing. In most cases, they cannot do both.
Not only is the community suffering with inadequate schooling and housing, but the resources for mental health are scarce. The community of about 2,000 suffers greatly as resources for mental health aid are extremely limited. This remote First Nations community, like many others, has intergenerational pain brought about by the brutal treatment of the minority group by the Canadian government. St. Anne's Indian Residential School, located in Fort Albany, Ontario, was unfortunately a place well known for older residents of Attawapiskat. One of Canada's most notorious residential schools, known for the alarming amount of physical and sexual abuses that took place there, one of which being the most notable method of torture, the homemade electric chair, operated until 1964. Rebecca Friday on Global News mentions the harsh realities faced by parents who are placed in the residential school system and the negative effects it has on their children. The inability to care for a child as they should stems from a history of abuse and lack of parental guidance in their own upbringing. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for people aged 15 to 25, which is an alarming statistic, but those concerning Aboriginal youth are far more frightening. Suicide rates are 5 to 7% higher for Indigenous youth than their non-identifying counterparts. In April of 2016, Attawapiskat's chief, Bruce Shishish, along with council, declared a state of emergency as there were 11 attempted suicides on one Saturday night alone. Shishish's desperate plea for assistance from the government was a letter he composed to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau that reads, "Dear Prime Minister Trudeau, I am writing to you today on a matter of life and death. Your intervention is immediately required, which is in crisis of attempted suicide by our youth here in Attawapiskat. The action that is required now is to have an audience with you as the Minister of Youth along with your Minister of Indigenous Affairs and the Minister of Health to have a discussion of our community concerns. While the effort of your ministers is appreciated to date, it falls short of finding a permanent solution for our youth here in Attawapiskat. As well, our discussions may also assist in helping other Northern Indigenous communities that are experiencing the same situation. Due to the urgent nature of the crisis in Attawapiskat and other Northern communities, I am asking this meeting take place prior to the Assembly of First Nations annual general meeting in June. As mentioned, time is our enemy, and we cannot afford to delay immediate action, and we may have more of our youth die or attempt to end their precious lives. In closing, my council acknowledges that you have reached out to our people across the country, and we once again appeal to your good judgment to prioritize your youth in your community and in Canada. We wait to hear from you. Yours with the deepest respect, Chief Bruce Shishish." The Band-Aid-like solution offered to this Northern Ontario community was a temporary 13-member team of security personnel, nurses, and mental health workers. A Mohawk psychotherapist and researcher at Thompson River University in Kamloops, British Columbia, suggests psychotherapy would potentially benefit the community, but in order for the therapy to work, trust between the therapist and their clients must be established, and this process would be likely unsuccessful, as the professionals are oftentimes non-Aboriginal and are coming from outside communities. At the time of this crisis, there was a job posting for a full-time, federally funded mental health position. There was only one candidate who applied for the vacant position, but declined the offer when she found out that she would not be offered the adequate housing the nurses are. A hot commodity when the community is in a housing crisis. Prior to this incident, there was one single permanent mental health worker on the reserve that was unavailable to people under the age of 18. 625 Attawapiskat's community members at this time were aged 0 to 19, meaning a large portion of the population was unable to be seen by one whom could assist with mental health concerns. 31% of Attawapiskat's residents were unable to receive the help they needed. The Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario suggests that if your child is in immediate danger, you are to call 911 or admit them to a hospital. More specifically, if they are below the age of 18, they are to be admitted to a hospital specialized in the care of children. A few of the children on suicide watch during this time in Attawapiskat were kept in holding cells under police watch. Although a hospital is not an ideal place to be when going through a difficult time, a jail cell would be far less comfortable, both physically and mentally, as these children were not receiving professional care under police protection. The Solutions to Youth Living in Distress works well for those with a hospital nearby, with an entire unit focused on bettering patients' mental health, but useless for those in remote communities lacking mental health professionals. Children's hospitals are not nearly as readily available as regular hospitals in urban areas, but for residents of Attawapiskat, medical care of any sort is far more difficult to attain than it is for those living in cities. The solution to this problem from leaders is oftentimes to move the group closer to an urban area. Jean Chrétien, Canada's former Prime Minister, suggested that when groups are struggling economically with scarce resources, people have to move sometimes. Now that's a solution. From a colonizing standpoint, displacing this group further and assimilating them into the dominant society is ideal. Canada has stripped First Nations groups of all they once had, and were essentially given the option to live on the little land they had been left with few resources and opportunities, or leave their communities behind to live in urban areas with access to better education, better health, and better living conditions. Although there is no way to pinpoint the reason for the 2016 suicide crisis in the community, a little knowledge on the matter will suffice. Systematic abuse has caused generations of pain unto Indigenous groups throughout Canada, and without help from the Canadian government to heal hundreds of years of wounds, progress is unlikely to be made. They might not look like the ones that exist in mainstream Toronto or Vancouver, but they worked for your ancestors for thousands of years, and we just have to bring them back. McCormick said this in an interview with Global News regarding bettering the means in which the government assists the community with mental health care. McCormick suggests healing practices that were once used in the past would be beneficial to the group. At the time of the suicide epidemic in Attawapiskat, Dr. Loris Kramer, a professor at McGill University, was in the midst of creating his project, Listening to One Another to Grow Stronger, a culturally based, family-centered approach to mental health promotion. The program was designed to enhance psychological, social, and emotional well-being among Indigenous youth and their families and communities. The program is aimed towards assisting Indigenous adolescents mentally while strengthening their cultural ties and not feeling as though outsiders are imposing, as they have a history of doing so. A psychologist at the University of Victoria, Christopher Lalonde, researched the correlation between cultural healing and suicide and found that communities with the lowest suicide rates are those with the most culturally healthy and have the strongest communities. As for more permanent solutions to the problems faced in Attawapiskat, a youth recreation centre is often suggested by the community. At the time of the crisis, the community had been promised a youth centre, a place where the children of Attawapiskat are able to get away from their overcrowded homes and work with families, elders, for cultural and wellness programming. There is nothing in this town, nothing for the kids. 2 years after the suicide epidemic swept through the northern Ontario town, the youth are still facing the same problem. There is no escape from their home or school. They need an outlet. They need a place where activity with their peers can rid their minds of the hardships their community faces. Carolyn Bennett, Minister for Crown Indigenous Relations, promised this community a permanent place for the youth of Attawapiskat to enjoy back in 2016. There has since been no progress made. The children have lost hope, as Bennett has successfully got their hopes up at the time, yet proved that Ottawa is full of empty promises for the struggling community. Tyson Sutherland, an Attawapiskat resident, said, "With the promise of the youth centre, it made me happy. The youth will have somewhere to go, something to do other than drugs." It is hard to fathom the thought of drugs being the sole activity for youth to partake in, coming from an urban area, but is one of the harsh realities this remote community faces, and the longer it takes for Ottawa to acknowledge it as such, the larger the problem will grow. In conclusion, we hope to have shed light on the misconception that Indigenous people receive the same resources as non-Indigenous Canadians. It is unfortunately the case, as demonstrated by this study of the Attawapiskat community, that Indigenous communities are underfunded and have limited access to critical resources.